going, we'll make a point of saving this and have a link to it on our webpage, and maybe we can send it out through the Facebook page too. Oh, there we are. We're recording. Okay, with that, I'm going to formally start this. Good afternoon, everyone. Glad you can make it for our Q&A with Director Alana DeJoseph about the documentary, A Towering Task. If you don't know, I'm Charlie Hunt, the current president of RPCV of Colorado, and I'll be moderating along with our past president, Suzanne Smith. Alana also happens to be one of us. She lives here in Denver and is a member of RPCV of Colorado. If you have a question for Alana, please put it in the chat box, which we will be monitoring. And please also keep yourself muted during our session today to minimize distracting noises. And with that, Alana, I'm going to turn it over to you for some initial comments.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me. This is nice. And the various Zoom Q&As I've got to be, it was nice to meet all the people, but now I know you guys are my peeps. This is Colorado. So that's wonderful. So all of this started back in 2013. I was involved in a couple of documentaries before this that aired on PBS. One was about a history of the U.S. Forest Service, and it was produced for the centennial of the U.S. Forest Service in 2005. And then another was a documentary about conservationist Aldo Leopold. And if you've never heard of Aldo Leopold, don't feel bad. Most people who aren't in the environmental or conservation movement community, or who aren't from Wisconsin or Iowa, have never heard of him. But the people who have heard of him name him as one of the Trinity, the Holy Trinity of Muir, Thoreau, and Leopold. So if you get a chance, get your hands on a Sand County Almanac, one of his most famous books, and read that. But so we were at a screening of Green Fire, which was our documentary about Aldo Leopold. And a few of us who had worked on it were sitting around talking about future projects. And as we were talking, it turned out there were several of us who were returned Peace Corps volunteers. And we asked, does anybody know, is there a documentary about the Peace Corps out there? It's been around a while. There should be something on the history of the Peace Corps. And as we started digging into it, we found that there wasn't really any overarching historical documentary about the Peace Corps. And if there were documentaries that touched on the Peace Corps, they usually only focused on the founding years, on the beginnings, or on individual volunteer experiences. So we quickly realized there was a need to make such a documentary, because while we as the Peace Corps community are really good at talking about the Peace Corps and talking to each other, the rest of America is forgetting that there is a Peace Corps. And I'm sure many of you have gotten the question of, oh, is that still around? Or didn't that have something to do with John F. Kennedy? So coming out of the Forest Service film, which there is an official Forest Service historian, it's an endowed chair at a university. The Forest Service has its own archives. And it seemed like this shouldn't be too complicated. We will find the official Peace Corps historian, and then we will find the official Peace Corps archive, and we'll just pull all that together and then interview a few volunteers, and there you have it. We have a documentary. Well, in true Peace Corps fashion, of course, that wasn't the case. There is no official Peace Corps historian, nor is there one singular place that is the archives of the Peace Corps. So in many ways, creating this documentary became creating its history. And that came with a huge responsibility, because we knew, as Peace Corps volunteers, we're storytellers. We love our mythology around the Peace Corps, and sometimes it's big fish stories, and sometimes the fish didn't exist in the first place. And so we knew that whatever we would tell in this documentary would become de facto history of the Peace Corps. And we felt that very strongly, that with our journalistic ethics, we had to follow every story down the rabbit hole and made sure it actually happened and it was actually true. And we also followed every cookie trail to every archive we could find. We pinged the RPCV community through the National Peace Corps Association, through RPCVs of Colorado, through all the affiliate groups and whatnot, and asked who's got video, who's got film, who's got pictures, who's got audio, who's got graphics, who's got material, send them our way. And at first I thought, is this smart? Because we're going to have 250,000 people sending us stuff. And everybody's going to want their story in there, and it's going to be all over the map. And but it was surprising, because we are like herding cats as returned Peace Corps volunteers. We're not like the Marine Corps, where somebody in charge yells something and everybody follows. So we got a decent amount of material, and we made many contacts. We interviewed over 200 people for the documentary, and pull together this really complex story that's not easy to tell, because of course it is a story of Peace Corps headquarters, and it's a story of all the different country posts, and it's a story of different eras, and it's a story of politics, and it's a story of culture. And so there are so many elements to this, from the very, very personal to the very global, that made it a very difficult story to tell, but also what a rewarding story to tell. It was a story of hope. It was a story of international engagement. And, over the last years, it really felt good to be talking about connection and cultural bridging and such. So we pulled it together by the skin of our teeth in time for the anniversary on September 22nd in 2019. So the 58th anniversary, and the Kennedy Center was gracious enough to host us, and we had our premiere there, and then we had several fun screenings at universities and libraries and museums. And on March 1st of 2020, we had a glorious screening with over 500 people, sold out at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library. And then we had another one planned in Miami for March 16th, and then everything shut down. And then we had to reinvent distribution of the film. And so it became all about virtual screenings, about these kinds of Zoom events, Q&As, and watching the film from home. And it had its ups and downs. I miss the audience where you could viscerally feel the reactions to the various pieces of the film when you're sitting there amongst the crowd watching the film. But at the same time, we can be so much more inclusive now. We can have people from across the globe joining us on these Zoom calls. So here we are, and I'd love to talk a little bit more about distribution and how you can help as we proceed, but I want to answer questions that you have. That's much more important.
I have a good question to start with, but before I do that, I do want to comment on when the film was shown at the Denver Film Festival at the end of 2019. And just from a person who kind of helped put that together and then helped with getting tickets set up to sell. Typically, RPCV of Colorado will get behind some film at the Denver Film Festival and buy 25 tickets for that, and then we sell them to our members. Well, for this film, because it was about Peace Corps, we talked in a board meeting. It's like, should we get more than 25 tickets for this? And someone said, yeah, let's get 50. What the heck? Let's just do it. So we got to put up on our website. Matter of fact, I think earlier that week I sent out an email saying, save this date, save this time. I can't tell you what it is yet, but I'm going to tell you as soon as I can, because it was all kind of coming up together in the background. And as soon as I put that up, tickets start going like right off the shelf. I think we sold all 50 tickets in 24 hours. So I went back to the film festival and said, can I have 20 more? And they did. So they gave me 20 more. And I think those got sold in 4 minutes or 4 hours. They were gone. So I said, can I get 20 more? And they said, yeah, but that's all we can give you. It's like, you've almost got the whole theater. And we sold them by the next day. They were all gone. There were 2 showings for the film festival initially, and they put on a 3rd one because it kept on selling out. So that was, I just had goosebumps while all that was going on. I hope you did too, Alana, because I really got
and what was so rewarding about it was that the first screening, at the end we asked, okay, who are returned Peace Corps volunteers here in the audience? And it was 99.9% returned Peace Corps volunteers. I think there was this lone couple sitting somewhere in the middle, kind of looking around. They weren't returned Peace Corps volunteers. And the second showing was probably 70% returned Peace Corps volunteers, 30% general public. And then by the 3rd showing, we had about 80% non-Peace Corps volunteers and non-Peace Corps folks. And that was exciting to me because I think it's incredibly important that we as a community understand our history, but it's so much more important that we reach beyond our community and get the American public reinformed about the Peace Corps.
So with that, let's start out with a question from Randy, who is also one of our board members. He's our membership chair. What were your most critical and difficult editing decisions?
Well, the first and most difficult one was how long to make the film, because if our name was Ken Burns, this would be a 13-hour story, or maybe we could make it 142 hours and then give an hour to each country. But so knowing that we're not Ken Burns, knowing that this would have to be an hour and a half, maybe an hour 45 long at the max, we had to really focus in on what the story was going to be. And when we first started, we were interviewing returned Peace Corps volunteers. We were talking to the Peace Corps community about the film, and it was all about philosophizing about the Peace Corps. So we had a lot of smart talking heads sitting around talking about diversity in the Peace Corps, talking about the 5-year rule for the Peace Corps, talking about, cultural imperialism, and, all these topics that are important to us, and that we've spent 2 years at site pondering and mulling over. And of course, we ended up with a 6-hour documentary that would have been boring as heck to anybody who wasn't a Peace Corps volunteer. And then we realized, okay, what it needs to be is a history that is very linear and that is geared towards a general public audience. We cannot be talking inside baseball. The 5-year rule, while important and having an impact on the culture of the Peace Corps, is irrelevant in an 1.5-hour documentary to somebody who only knows about the Peace Corps that it may have had something to do with John F. Kennedy. So we pared it down and we made our filter. It has to take us along the historical timeline. So it has to push our movement forward. So when we interviewed volunteers, we focused in on, okay, we need volunteers from this era and this area of the world. We need volunteers from this era and that area of the world. And it slowly whittled down what the story needed to be. And then the other thing was we wanted these historical anchors, these historical turning points of, why is it important to talk about women in development in the Peace Corps at this point? Or why is it important to talk about the African Food Systems Initiative of the Peace Corps in the 80s? And then we would find all these big historical things that happened. And somehow it was like, where's Waldo? There was always Peace Corps involved, from the Iran hostage crisis and having 3 RPCVs be hostages of that hostage crisis to the AFSI team. I was on an African Food Systems Initiative team in the early 90s, but I hadn't realized that it came out of the famine in Ethiopia that we had all seen on TV and we all understood. So these were connections to the American public and really to the global public of things that they knew about. And so then they could tie the Peace Corps in, going like, oh, they were there too. Oh, they were involved in this too. And that's how we had to really, really pare it down. And even with that in mind, of course, we couldn't talk about everything. And it felt like every country we talked about had a documentary in it, in itself. And so, when we first talked about these vignettes that we would have about the different countries with Dominican Republic, Liberia, and Ukraine, for example, for Dominican Republic, we thought, well, we don't want to just make it about the revolution. We want to have, spread into different times there. With the Liberia, we were talking about Americans don't understand this incredible history that Liberia has in connection to America, but there was just no time to talk about that. And that made it difficult to cut some of those things out because we were launching down multiple documentary paths. And then it just had to pare it down and end with, we had a little bit of a Ken Burns style in the history for sure, but we also wanted to be more contemporary because one of the problems the Peace Corps has, of course, is that people see it as this historical organization. They don't see it as a contemporary organization. And so we knew we couldn't dwell on the 60s for most of the film. We had to fairly quickly get to current day. And that's where we have Danielle Leroy, Peace Corps volunteer in Dominican Republic, his great soundbite of when I signed up for the Peace Corps, my parents said, does that still exist? Didn't that have something to do with JFK? And so that's what ended up paring down. But there were a lot of difficult edit decisions for sure.
Is there anything that really stands out, like one thing in particular is like, geez, I really wish I got that in there?
Well, I think, given that we premiered it in 2019, and then of course in the summer of 2020, first everybody got evacuated in March. So that would have been a really nice thing to have had in the documentary because it really sets us up to what is Peace Corps 2.0 going to be. But also in the summer of 2020, the Black Lives Matter protests reminded us of how the story of the Peace Corps often overlooks the diversity question. And while we were very sensitive and attuned to the whole notion of how do we talk about cultural imperialism, how do we talk about neo-imperialism, the whole notion of the white saviorism and how Peace Corps itself structurally makes it difficult or narrows down what segment of society of Americans can actually join the Peace Corps by who can take these 2 years off with not really much pay and various other burdens that make it difficult to join the Peace Corps. I think in retrospect, I wish we could have included more of that. And there were some great sound bites we've had, and hopefully down the line when we get to put this on PBS, we will do some minor re-editing and can bring some of those sound bites back. But I think of Haskell Ward, who's very early on in the documentary. He was a Peace Corps volunteer, African American, and he said that he faced a lot of pressure from his community saying, what the heck are you doing going overseas with the Peace Corps now when we have the civil rights movement here? We need you here. We don't need you overseas. And I think that's a really important question to consider. And the Peace Corps really is wrestling with that right now, with its own diversity, the structure, the systemic racism and all that. And we come on these Zoom calls, and it looks awfully white on these Zoom calls, right? And so how much that is part of what percentage the Peace Corps is diverse, and it actually has a decent percentage of diversity right now of volunteers, and what part of that is that the community isn't including more diverse volunteers, or that not saying purposefully excluding, but that they don't find a home, is of course something that needs to be looked at. So I wish we could have included a little bit more, and I'm looking forward to, in the PBS re-edit, to include a little bit more of that.
While we're on that topic, this might be a good time for Kathy McCallum. She asked the question, what are the main factors affecting the drop in numbers of volunteers since the peak in the 60s? It's kind of related to this, and I don't know whether you got into that as part of your research.
Yeah, well, the numbers game is what it was called, right? There was this passion to make the Peace Corps big and bold. That was what the whole paper, the Towering Task paper, was all about, that if you're going to do it, make it big. And so at the beginning, you have the charisma of John F. Kennedy. You have the president's brother-in-law, who's the director of the Peace Corps and who's an incredibly charismatic person. You have the media covering Peace Corps, from the local hometown newspaper to the network TV stations. You have a media landscape that is set up to air public service announcement on a regular basis. That changed in the 80s when the Fairness Doctrine was removed, and suddenly you have a programmer at a TV station and they have two shelves, and here are the PSAs, and here's the programming that's going to make the station money. They're going to pick the stuff that's going to make the station money. And so the PSAs went out the window. And then, of course, the internet comes around, and suddenly it's a media landscape where rising above the din is incredibly hard. And the budget that the Peace Corps has now for advertisement and reaching the public is a fraction of what it had in the early 60s. So that's part of it. There's just a lack of awareness, for sure. There's also a lot of competition in organizations. There are other ways to do similar things of what the Peace Corps does. I would argue there's no other organization that does exactly what the Peace Corps does, but there are other ways to get overseas. People are more able to get overseas, and then the biggest hit that the Peace Corps got was, of course, the Vietnam War. It was this disillusionment with the government, that people just did not want to be part of the government and didn't want to go overseas as what could be perceived as neo-imperialists. So the Peace Corps suffered a little bit in its image. And of course, those of us who've served in the Peace Corps know that once you're over there, you are not a tool of American foreign policy, and you very much are whatever you make of it in those 2 years that you're there. But I believe there are a lot of factors that contributed to the dropping numbers. And even now, Peace Corps has more applicants than it has slots to fill, but it's not that overwhelming response that there was in the 60s. And then, we are a more litigious society. And so all the things that have to be taken care of to be careful, and people are a little more worried to go overseas. We're a little more afraid than we used to be, I think. So all of those, I think, are factors that have contributed.
We get on a call with Peace Corps every 2 months regarding the partnership between Peace Corps and Rotary, and I talk about litigious. It's like when we talk about ideas, it's like, is legal going to have to take a look at that, make a decision on that before we actually move this forward? That's a constant refrain that happens in those meetings. Well, Suzanne, you got something? I'm sorry, go ahead, Alana.
You think of it, for Peace Corps, a dropped postcard could mean the end of a country program. So it's understandable that Peace Corps is very skittish. At the same time, it wasn't that skittish in the 60s. It had a lot of swagger, and that led to some big mistakes, but it also led to some grand ideas. I think of a Peace Corps volunteer told me that in the 60s that volunteers who were nurses taught women in South America to not breastfeed, to use formula, because that was the best knowledge of the time that we had in the United States. And when you come in as a Peace Corps volunteer, you get listened to. And so that comes with a lot of responsibility. So I see how Peace Corps is much more skittish now, but I think it needs to get a little bit of its swagger back. And that bold vision needs to come back for sure.
Did you know that there was a second incident with a drop postcard?
I did not.
In India. And actually, I think a person on this call today could tell us more about that at some point. But let's move along with some questions. Suzanne, what you got?
Alana, you talked you referenced Ken Burns style documentary that goes on for however many episodes, or PBS. So I'm imagining you have thousands of hours of footage. So what are your thoughts or dreams for how to use it? And then are there particular stories that you can share that you would want to be in those?
Well, I would love to do a Towering Task 2, because in my mind, there's a second documentary now that starts with the evacuation of Peace Corps volunteers in March of 2019 and ends with the agency being rebuilt and having reinvented itself. With what does it mean to be the Peace Corps in a time of climate change and mass migration and global pandemics. It would be a fascinating documentary to produce, because it would be a case study in how does a government agency get built in the first place. Now, I would have some of the footage to use from the interviews that we had, but of course it would be great to, get a spy into the Peace Corps building and and get people's honest opinions on what's going on, which is difficult with an agency that is very litigious and that is very guarded in its communications. But there are plenty of us around that could tell a really fascinating story for that, for sure. There are, we went to 3 countries. We went to the Dominican Republic and Liberia and Ukraine, and I would love to do a half-hour documentary on each Peace Corps country. We would have much of the footage for Liberia. We could supplement it with some. We could do the same with the Dominican Republic and Ukraine, and then do a documentary on how did the Peace Corps evolve in that country, because those are such unique stories too, and various evacuations and wars and famines and natural disasters where Peace Corps volunteers were saving, were working with locals and saving schools and buildings and whatnot. And so each of those, I'd love to spend the rest of my life just doing a Peace Corps country documentary each year. But all of that is funding, and producing documentaries is always a nightmare when it comes to funding. So Towering Task was produced for roughly $700,000, which is about the money that it takes to do a PBS documentary, and that does not include really distribution, so like full-on distribution. So putting it on PBS would cost us $285,000. That's beyond the production budget that we now have to raise, that we're working on raising. Doing those half-hour documentaries would be probably a couple $100,000 each. And so I once the documentary was done, Towering Task was done, I breathed a giant sigh of relief of, okay, no fundraising for a while. And then PBS says, yes, but we need station relations money, and we need packaging. And so we're kind of back to that. But those would be future programs. I would love to do a Towering Task 2, and I would love to do a piece on each country.
If anyone wants to donate to that cause, can you put for getting on PBS?
Oh.
If you can put a link into the chat, that would be good. Suzanne, do you got anything else? What else do you got?
I mean, I can keep going, Randy. I'm famous for asking lots of questions. I think about just reflecting on like country documentaries and the fact that you said some of it, like, it becomes history. Like in Mongolia, for Peace Corps Mongolia, where I served, there is the story that like the second group came in the winter, and only one person ever went through. And whether or not that's true or not is up to Peace Corps historian that you don't know where that exists. But I think that's the true for all of our countries, or you have those stories that get handed down. So you talked about this a little bit, but why did you choose not to do as much like a day in the life of a Peace Corps volunteer to illustrate what that meant for those who don't serve in the Peace Corps?
That's a really good question, because I feel that is kind of a visceral experience and essence that is important for the American public to experience. but it felt like we did not have the time for that. If we wanted to cover 60 years of history in an hour and a half, hour and 45, we pretty much had to boogie through it. And we tried to get as much of that personal experience in there as we could by having the volunteers of the different eras and the different regions give us little insights into their experiences. But it felt like, you know, there are many books on Peace Corps volunteer experiences, and there are some films on that. So part of that was out there already. And we didn't have the time that I would have wanted to do both really well, to have that volunteer experience and the history in there. So we decided to focus on the history and bring in as much experience as we could by having volunteers help drive the story forward with the historical part.
That experience too has got to really be different depending upon which decade you served in a lot of ways too. I didn't realize this, but I found out after we got back from service that Vanuatu was one of the last countries, Peace Corps countries, where you could have experience similar to what was in Africa in the 1960s. You know, no running water, no electricity. But I know, like Ken and Bernadine, they were in the Ukraine, you know, 15 years ago, more or less. And I'm sure they were living in a real building and probably had electricity and running water.
Sometimes,
so
sure.
Yeah, or sometimes, right?
Better watch out, Charlie. Otherwise, we'll get in a competition of who didn't have running water and electricity
That's right.
closer to 2018.
It's that meme, right, of the water glass that has the water to the middle of the point, and it says, you know, optimist, glass is half full, pessimist, glass is half empty, Peace Corps volunteer. I could take a bath with that.
I love that. I love that. We've got another really good question from Randy here. It's like, this has got some nice layers to it. The film rolls out in chronological segments and also incorporates in many geographic segments. How did you envision, oops, excuse me, I need to open this up just a little bit more. How did your vision evolve between telling the story episodically versus continuously and blending time and global space - history and themes? There's a lot to unpack there, but give it a go.
That's a beautiful question, and it, you know, really gets at the dilemma of how do you tell the Peace Corps story, because really the Peace Corps is so many different elements, and you know, you can tell it completely focused on headquarters, and that story is fascinating for all its political intrigue and machinations as they change over time. You can tell it completely from the field and make it very much the volunteer experience. You could even go further and make it the host country national experience. And to us, really, each of those elements was incredibly important because it's all these layers of the Peace Corps. So yes, you have headquarters on the one hand, making some of these grand decisions of which countries to open, which countries to close, and what programming to focus on. But then you also have the country director in Tanganyika in the 60s who says, I don't really care what they say at headquarters because they can't get to me. It's too far. And they're doing their own thing. You have the host country nationals who have a whole different experience of what the Peace Corps is, and who in many ways carry our institutional memory, because host country nationals who work for the Peace Corps are not subject to the 5-year rule. So American staff cannot serve longer than 5 years in the Peace Corps, work in the Peace Corps for more than 5 years, and they have to go away for 5 years before they can come back and work for the Peace Corps again. That does not apply to host country nationals. And so for many countries, it's the host country nationals who've been working for the Peace Corps since, you know, it entered the country, and they're holding all that history, all that memory that the American staff doesn't have. So there are all these aspects, and that's just even in a slice of time. Then comes the time, how everything has changed over that time, and then layered on that is the geography of, well, what might be true for an African Peace Corps story might not be true at all for one in South America or one in Asia. And those experiences were in many ways very different. Not even to bring up Eastern Europe, which, you know, got a lot of flack from Peace Corps volunteers who thought that just wasn't right. But, you know, we went to Ukraine and we saw it was very much Peace Corps. And when we were filming, we arrived in Ukraine on a Friday. On Saturday, it was going to be Babushka's birthday. So it was the grandmother's birthday of the volunteer we were interviewing. And so they invited us to this wonderful dinner at the house, and you know, in Ukraine the food is just amazing. They just cover the entire table with food, and they mirror it so that on each side it's the same food, so you don't have to reach across the table to get whatever you want. It's on the table twice, and then wherever there's a little gap is where a water glass sized glass of vodka goes, that you're supposed to drink. And so that's how we arrived. And first of all, April Martin, who's a volunteer who we interviewed, the spark in her eye when she talked about her experience and her connection to this family was the same as any volunteer we interviewed from the 60s or from, you know, the 90s in African countries, in South American countries, and Asian countries. So you could already tell emotionally it was the same experience. And then in terms of the technical difficulties, we were in the middle of filming, and our audio guy, he's like, okay, I'm going to turn this background light off. And the whole family goes, don't. But before they could stop him, he flipped the switch and it just shut everything down, because it was the big power switch or the connection that kept everything going. And so then they had to reboot everything. But so Eastern Europe comes with its own challenges, and whether that's cold and not having any heat, or having running water only sometimes, or electricity not at all, or sometimes, or having an outhouse when it's really, really cold outside. So Ken and Bernadine, respect.
Suzanne, you got another one?
I'll just call attention in the chat. I said, because I saw someone related to me was waving their hand, that they might have a question. So if you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat. This is a little off the stories that we were talking about Peace Corps. I'm curious, why Annette Bening as the narrator?
That's a good question, because I have gotten that question a few times too. And you know, Annette Bening doesn't have anything to do with the Peace Corps. But when I was working on the Leopold documentary, I learned my lesson on why a celebrity narrator matters. Why you can't just have somebody with a pretty voice, or why it makes it more difficult to have somebody with just with a pretty voice. So when we did the documentary on Leopold, we called it Green Fire, because Aldo Leopold has an essay in a Sand County Almanac called Thinking Like a Mountain. And in that essay, he describes his experience as a young man of sitting on a high rim rock and wanting to shoot a deer down below and aiming at it and killing what he thought was a deer. And then when he comes down, he realizes that he actually killed a mother wolf. And he describes the moment of horror and regret as arriving in time to see the green fire dying in her eyes. And so green fire has become kind of this rallying cry in the environmental community about preserving our environment. And so while we were doing the Leopold documentary, which we felt like we have to call it Green Fire because those are Leopold's words, there was somebody in the Bay Area who's doing a documentary about the environmental movement, and he wanted to call it Green Fire, and he decided to call the film Green Fire, even though we asked, you know, could you maybe not? And he's like, nope, it's going to be Green Fire. And what happened was that he had connections, and there are multiple theories why he went through, I think he had 5 different narrators or so. I'm not sure what the relationships were there, but he had Robert Redford, and he had Meryl Streep, and he had several other A-list names distributing the documentary. Mind you, we had Peter Coyote, who's also a known actor, but not on that same level. And so when we were distributing the documentary, whenever I called people saying, hey, I'm here to distribute the documentary about Leopold called Green Fire. Oh, is that the one with Robert Redford narrating? And every time I said, no, we're the one with Peter Coyote. You know? So I realized we needed a celebrity narrator to distinguish it, to open some of those doors for us, to, you know, kind of raise the flag outside of our community, how important the Peace Corps is. And the way we connected with Annette Bening was Peace Corps Network. We have the most amazing network. You know, I always refer back to the 90s game of 6 Degrees to Kevin Bacon, to the Hollywood actor, and everybody would try and trace how they were connected to Kevin Bacon. I think it's 1 degree to a Peace Corps volunteer. There's a Peace Corps volunteer around every corner. And so we interviewed Hollywood film director Taylor Hackford, who was a Peace Corps volunteer, and he's in the film. You know, he was in Bolivia, and his wife happens to be Helen Mirren. And so he and I were talking about, the celebrity narrator, who should it be? And I was pretty adamant. I wanted a female narrator. I had just gone through 2 environmental films, which, also communities that are much dominated by older white guys. And I apologize to all the any white guys on this call, but I was ready to have a female voice narrate this documentary, especially since the majority of volunteers now are women. And so we went through some names, and I was toying with the idea of Angelina Jolie because she has some international credibility, and he was saying, comes with a little baggage these days. And so he said, let me talk to Helen about this. We'll figure something out. And then I got an email from him, and it said, would Annette Bening do? And I just sat there, and I jumped out of my jumped out of my seat, and like, would Annette Bening do? Yeah, hell yes, she would do. And then I sat down calmly and said, I believe so. This would be wonderful. And not only did she agree to do it, she offered her services for free, which was amazing. The Forest Service documentary was narrated by Charlie Osgood, and it cost us $15,000 to make that happen. Annette Bening donated, so that's at least $15,000, if not more, of a value that we got. And when we did the recording, we were in this recording studio. It was the screenwriter Shauna Kelly and I. And both of us were a little starstruck. We were like, what's she going to be like? Is she going to arrive with an entourage, or, how's she going to behave? Is she going to be super standoffish? We don't know. And then she shows up. She's by herself. She drove herself. She comes in, and the first thing she does is she opens up her arms and says, I'm a hugger. Is that okay? And we just melted. At that point, we just fell in love with her. And now Annette Bening cannot do it wrong in my book. And if you ever find yourself in an opportunity to support Annette Bening, please do so.
Great story. We have Kathy McCollum has put up another question here in the chat. There were 4 countries sending volunteers to Jamaica when she was there. How much does the Peace Corps acknowledge this? There are 5 volunteers living. There were 5 volunteers living in my town. 2 of us working through the parish, not just at the technical school. And I do kind of know too that there's something like 40 some odd Peace Corps type organizations from 40 countries around the world, something to that effect, similar to the Peace Corps.
That was one of the topics that we were philosophizing about in our 6-hour version of the documentary. And that was really important to me because, in the vein of American exceptionalism, we like to think of ourselves as inventing everything and being the first at everything. And of course, when Peace Corps was born, there were several other organizations already in existence. VSO existed already. Canada had its volunteer service. Australia had one. There were several other countries that had volunteer services, and some of them were through their government. And so it was important to me that we put that into the beginning, and we didn't have a lot of time to say a lot about it. But the interesting discussion to me comes in how they've evolved over time versus how the Peace Corps has evolved over time. Because what I found looking into some of these volunteer organizations is that a lot of them have focused on their version of Goal 1 more. They've become more technical development organizations, while Peace Corps still continues to work hard and try hard to straddle that fence between cultural exchange program and development organization. And that's, something that Peace Corps gets accused of often, that it focuses too much on cultural exchange and not really contribute anything to the society. But then as soon as you focus more on the development, then you get criticized for what it is that you do in development, because it might be more damaging than it might be good. And so to me, that whole subject of what does the organization do is incredibly important, and discussing that in light of what every other country is doing around the world would be a fascinating topic. So Peace Corps very proudly talks about other organizations that have been born out of the Peace Corps. So for example, in Germany, the German Development Agency was created coming out of the Peace Corps. In 1963, JFK was in Berlin congratulating Germany on starting its own version of a Peace Corps. Now, I was just on a Zoom Q&A with the U.S. mission to Germany and the German Development Agency, and a scholar from the university in Munich, a JFK scholar from the university in Munich, and discussing about how has the German Development Service evolved from that point in different ways from the Peace Corps. And they've definitely focused more on actual technical skills and bringing people that would have very specific projects than the Peace Corps has. So yeah, Peace Corps likes to acknowledge the ones that have been born out of the Peace Corps. It doesn't focus all that much on the ones that have been around from before the Peace Corps and how much really there was a culture already about this whole notion of volunteering. So yeah, it's a difficult question, and I would love to do a documentary sometime that would just be called Service and talk about how civil service has evolved over time, because I think all civil service organizations are seeing a decline. Peace Corps is seeing a decline, Rotary is seeing a decline, Lions Club is seeing a decline, Kiwanis, even VFW, all these organizations that are turning towards service in the civil space are having a hard time telling their story today. And it would be a fascinating subject of why is that, and how are we as a global community evolving, and how can we evolve to make service more central again?
Do we want to do, Suzanne, you suggest that we might do a decade call out. If people are interested in doing that and turning their videos on, and we can just do a quick, like, which decade did you serve in?
Yeah, so we do this, we're a smaller group, so this might be a little easier, but we do this a lot in our in-person events. And it feels very appropriate to do it with a towering task since the film goes through the decades so nicely. But we have a variety of decades represented here, but I don't know if we have anybody who served in the first few years of Peace Corps on the call. So either through your video, or if you don't want to appear on video, if you're at the bottom of your screen, you can see there's reactions like a thumbs up, clapping hands, etc. And you're welcome to just use clapping hands. So we're just curious of who's on the call, who served in the 60s. I know what my father's is a half up because he also transitions us to the 70s.
Hey, all the 70s, thumbs up, nice.
Yeah. And we have the 80s. Which was really interesting to reflect on how drastically it dropped in the 70s, but the 80s are the years, like that's where we see the fewest volunteers at our events that will raise their hands. I know we have some 90s based on people's screen names. 2000 to 2010. 2010 to, I don't think we had anybody who was evacuated on the call, but so 2010 to now. Yeah. Sometimes at the in-person events, we have the people that, one luckily volunteer walked off the plane basically from traveling home from Peace Corps and into our Christmas party. So, I see we have do you have any thoughts on what a Peace Corps 2.0 would look like in the chat?
Thanks for that question, Marcia. Yeah. Well, I'm not in the heads of headquarters of what they are trying to reinvent, but I think many of the things that Peace Corps has done since the beginning fit very well into the global problems we're facing now. I mean, climate change has been around since before the term existed, and Peace Corps volunteers very much have been at the forefront of it, working in agriculture, forestry, fisheries, and such in the countries that are bearing the brunt of climate change. So that very much needs to continue, and what Peace Corps can do, in my mind, is focus it more specifically on climate change. There's the ecotourism projects like what Danielle Leroy did in the Dominican Republic. There are many climate change mitigation projects that volunteers could be doing, and partnering them with the right organizations within the country could be crucial for that. Of course, the pandemic is a great reminder of how important the health sector is. And the education sector has always been the biggest sector for the Peace Corps, but health has always been around, and it's been one of the most respected sectors of the Peace Corps because there's very tangible results to what health volunteers do. Now, again, the litigious society we're in, it's been difficult for volunteers to do clinical work. When Peace Corps first started, there were doctors, there were nurses doing clinical work that were Peace Corps volunteers. And all of that has changed over the years, and there's been less and less clinical work. There was, for a while, there was the SEED Global Health Program that existed a few years ago, started by John Kerry's daughter. Peace Corps partnered with them. And so there were Peace Corps response volunteers as doctors and as nurses working in various countries, including Liberia. But that partnership broke apart, and so that doesn't exist anymore. And so it will be fascinating to see how Peace Corps reinvents its health sector and can focus on pandemics, global pandemics. This pandemic is going to stay around for a few years. We're not out of the woods anytime soon, and especially in the countries where Peace Corps serves. So this might be a wonderful opportunity for volunteers to make really meaningful differences in the countries where they are sent to, in helping with mitigating the pandemic. So I would love to see climate change and pandemics high up. I'd like to see the environmental sectors and the health sector being focused on a lot. The education sector will always be important, and I think it is a mainstay of the Peace Corps and should always still be around. It was interesting to me in the 70s, there was this struggle around the education sector because Carolyn Payton was the director of the Peace Corps, first African-American woman to head the Peace Corps, and first woman to head the Peace Corps, first African-American woman to head the Peace Corps. And at the time, the Peace Corps was under Action, under the umbrella agency of Action. And Sam Brown, who was at the time the head of Action, he wanted to focus on what he called basic needs. So he wanted volunteers to be doing agriculture and forestry and food and focus on the basic needs. And he thought education was unnecessary for Peace Corps to be in. And Carolyn Payton felt very much the opposite. She felt strongly that education has always been part of the Peace Corps, and it's important because that's where Peace Corps volunteers can do some of the most solid work that they do. And it ended up that she left the Peace Corps over that disagreement, and it was so unfortunate that that she had passed away by the time we were producing the documentary, because I would have loved to have interviewed her, because she really could have summarized a lot of these important themes for the Peace Corps for us. Yeah. Long answer to a short question.
We've got another question from Randy in the chat. How cooperative was Peace Corps itself in providing access to source material and people? I know Jody Alston appears in several segments, but given it was the prior administration, was there any hesitancy from the organization? Litigious, can you say litigious, I'm guessing, probably?
I can tell you that it was a lot harder to work with the Peace Corps than it was to work with the Forest Service. While the directors were very accommodating and very nice, it didn't seem like they were running the agency. It was the lawyers that were running the agency. And the lawyers were super skittish. They're like, you know, this is not being produced by us, so it's independent, so we have no control over the content, so we can't really, you know, work together on this. At the same time, Carrie Hessler-Radlett was amazing because she kind of put the hammer down and said, work with her. And so when we went to Liberia and Ukraine, those country directors were incredible. They were awesome, because I said to Carrie, you know, you guys should be trying to figure out ways to take advantage of me, of this film, so that you can get your talking points out. And yes, maybe I can filter that and say, yes, I'll accept that and I won't accept that. But that should be the Peace Corps' role, to try and get their story out as much as they can, and pressuring the filmmakers to get as much of that story in those talking points. But they weren't doing any of that. They were just staying hands off in many ways from the headquarters perspective, not the directors, but everybody else. And the country directors were amazing. And we had a little struggle in the Dominican Republic. At the time, the country director did not want to talk to us and did not want her volunteers to talk to us. And but when we reminded her that the country director can't really forbid volunteers from talking to the media, that was a point that was settled back during the Vietnam War when volunteers were protesting the war, then she begrudgingly allowed volunteers to talk to us, but no staff talked to us. And in fact, when we arrived at the country headquarters, because of course I knew that we would be damned one way or another. If we didn't show up, we would be the rude filmmakers who didn't even bother to show up at the headquarters. But we did show up, and we weren't even let into headquarters. So we were left to waiting outside for 20 minutes at the guard booth. And then when we then they let us into the guard booth, but not through the metal detector into any of the offices to interview anybody. We didn't get to interview anybody. And the guard booth, we weren't even allowed to have our phones because we might record something. So that to me gave me a little bit of that feel of where Peace Corps gets a little paranoid. And ends up hurting itself, because how much better could the Dominican story have been if we had had some staff, even some host country national staff who might have been around during the revolution, could have talked about that to us. But then I told Carrie about it, and she was like, "Oh my God, when I heard that, that was terrible." And we talked to Bill Josephson, who was the founding general counsel of the Peace Corps, and his first reaction was, "I keep telling every director, the lawyers work for you. You don't work for the lawyers." So it was challenging. It had its challenges, but it also had some brilliant moments. And without the country directors in Ukraine and Liberia, we wouldn't have gotten as wonderful profiles as we did.
Suzanne, do you have another one?
Mine's a slight joke, but I'm going to ask it anyways. Colorado has a lot of connections to Peace Corps. Did you find it easier to meet with some of the directors because of those connections? And so for those who don't know, Richard Select, who was interviewed, lives in Colorado. Nick Craw, who was interviewed, lives in Colorado. Carrie Hessler-Radlett's daughter lives in Colorado. Anybody fast enough to spot the reference to Colorado State University in the Towering Task memo that appeared on screen, I was like, look. Things like that. So did you find it easier or harder because of the Colorado connection?
Oh, that was
there's another connection in there too, in case you don't know it. Mark Schneider, his son is at DU and is very much involved in the Coverdell program over there, Aaron Schneider.
Nice.
Christopher Hill was the former head of University of Denver's International Studies program, et cetera.
And Sam Brown, who was the last head of Action, he also lives in Colorado. He's in Aspen. That made it a lot easier. I got to meet in person with Sam Brown. I, got to interview Nick Craw at his offices, I think down in Centennial, and we interviewed Dick Celeste down in Colorado Springs. And we took advantage of a lot of NPCA Connect conferences too, to interview people when they were gathering. So that was helpful. It was great being. The other thing that I really liked about being in Colorado was I was outside of the Beltway. There are incredible amounts of pressures inside the Beltway of what you should be telling, what the story should be, what you can talk about, what you can talk about. And while Peace Corps might not have been pressuring me, I'm sure everybody else would have. And every time I went to DC, I had fun recording all the muckety mucks and all the important people, but it always felt great to leave DC again and be back in Colorado and then be editing without that pressure.
I see a comment in here by Marcia. I'm sorry, did you have something else you want to say, Susan?
You can say Marcia's comment first.
Okay. She says, I would like to say that watching the documentary, I felt very proud to be an RPCV. And I would also comment too, if you really do feel that way, there's actually a bumper sticker for that. It says, proud to have served my country, and it has the Peace Corps logo on it. And we were actually traveling across country a couple of years ago, Nancy and I, and we were in a barbecue place in Kansas City, and we came out and we found this note on our car, and I thought someone had hit their car, and they were like, but they just said, thank you for your service. They left a note to that effect. Yeah.
That's wonderful.
Is that in the store? Is that in the Peace Corps store?
Yes, I believe it is, either Peace Corps or NPCA.
They used to have bumper magnets, which I'm still hoping that they're going to bring back, just because I don't want to stick anything on my car, but magnet would be great.
Yeah.
Alana, the related to Colorado question is, since I know, so for those who might remember, I remember the first time you came to one of our big events for Return Peace Corps Volunteers of Colorado and talked about this vision you had. But I also remember your daughter showing up and saw that she got credited as a production assistant, I believe. So does she have has she talked to you about any of the experience and reflected on it with you?
Absolutely. So she is 13 years old now. So when we started the film, she was 7 years old. And the reason she's credited as a production assistant is because she actually kicked butt, I have to tell you, because one of the things that is incredibly frustrating about Peace Corps is finding the data, finding the actual scholarship on the Peace Corps. So there's a lot of data on the Peace Corps website, but it's so scattered and so all over the place that it is hard to see any kind of trends over time. So her first assignment was to scour the Peace Corps website and put together a list of all the countries, when the Peace Corps was in them, when the Peace Corps left, when the Peace Corps went back in them, how many volunteers served over time total, how many volunteers were in country at that time. So I had a beautiful Google spreadsheet put together by an, at the time, 11-year-old. That was better than any of the information you could get on the Peace Corps website. And I've shared it like with John Coyne of Peace Corps Worldwide, the website, and he's like, oh, this is great. This is wonderful. I've been looking for this all over. It's interesting because, you know, a large part of her life, her mom has been talking about the Peace Corps. So she probably knows more about the Peace Corps than many Peace Corps volunteers do, and certainly more than the average American who doesn't have any connections with the Peace Corps does. And I'm hoping that both my son, who's 2 years older, and my daughter will join the Peace Corps when the time comes. But we'll see. They might feel like they've already done their Peace Corps service.
I have a comment question regarding, as you get to the end of the film, talking about bringing it home, which really strikes me. I know I am a completely different person for having served, particularly as an older volunteer, and what that's led me to, particularly in Rotary. And I know there's more than a few Rotarians on this call. And Kathy McCullum has been very active in something called Friendship Force, which has to do with international service. But and then recently, Glenn Bloomhurst, I heard him talking, and he talked about, we almost should flip the 3 goals. It's like the most important one is what you bring home. And did that crush your mind very much as you were interviewing people, or come up with any particularly interesting stories about people who really, their life changed?
Absolutely. I think the bringing it home part of it is a big part of the story that we couldn't really delve too deeply into, and that we probably didn't, from a Peace Corps community perspective, didn't do enough justice to in the story of A Towering Task. However, it was also the part of the story that has the biggest danger of becoming self-congratulatory. So when we were applying for funding for the documentary, we applied to the National Endowment for the Humanities, and we applied to various other documentary funders. And the feedback we would get is, oh no, we're too worried this is going to be a celebratory piece. This is going to feel too much like PR or recruitment. And when you focus a lot on the bringing it home and the great things return volunteers are doing, it starts not sounding like a documentary much anymore. So we had to be incredibly careful how we treated it. And if we were, you know, if we went in depth into it, we would have had to bring up the numbers, and nobody has the numbers of the 250,000 return volunteers that there are, how many have these glorious projects. So if we focus on one and we make it seem like every volunteer who comes back next runs a nonprofit that saves an entire city, that's disingenuous. But we couldn't counterbalance that with any numbers, because we couldn't say this percentage goes into nonprofits, this percentage goes into government service, or so on. So we treaded a little more lightly on that goal than I think I would have loved to as a returned Peace Corps volunteer. But as a documentarian, I had to be a little more careful.
I would say too, having talked to Keith Honda, who is the past 3rd goal director at Peace Corps, and I forget who the name of the current one is, but getting people to make a point of letting them know what we're up to and what we're doing is just an ongoing challenge. Yeah.
Could I please make a comment? I think the emphasis, as you just mentioned, was what service we put in. But I think it's not so much what we're doing when we come back as how we feel. I think, just as an example, I grew up in upstate New York, and I didn't even know people got to California before we went across, because everything was so provincial in training. And in the United States, we tend to think, as you mentioned earlier, well, we're providing these great services. When I came back from the Peace Corps, I mean, I felt like I'm one of the world. And that's not that aren't I wonderful, look what I did. It was like, wow, all the things that were happening that other people were doing. So I have a kind of a glitch about the idea of how wonderful that we've come back and now we are all doing service. But we came back with a broader feeling personally. And in my case, I met my husband there. It was in the following year, I have my son was born there. We have an adopted daughter. We've been back to visit. So it is an integral part of my family and my awareness of the world. So it's not how many service groups we've created, but how we feel that seems important.
I think
That
that's a
makes-
really good point. And Peter Hessler says it at one point in the film. He says what Peace Corps really teaches you is that humility too, that notion of the global citizen, that, you're not the grand savior who's coming and fixing the village and then, brushing their hands off and going back home, but who just somebody learned that they are, as you just said so beautifully. It was like a perfect soundbite. I was like, for sure we had that in the documentary. I was part of the world, I think that that learning that America isn't the end all is one of the most beautiful lessons that we get from the Peace Corps.
I'd like to just follow up, Kathy. I love what you said, and I think not focusing on individual stories is a plus in the documentary. I think it's not about the individual people; it's about the spirit of this grand idea of service. That it's a global idea. And so I think it diminishes it if it focuses too much on individuals. I thought it was the balance of that we're talking about Peace Corps, this experiment, this towering task and I love the way you finished the film by saying we just begin. This is not going to be finished, and it's evolving and it's going to stay relevant. It's going to find a way to stay relevant, and the people will make it relevant. So yeah, I appreciated that there wasn't focus on individual stories in the documentary.
I think it'd be hard also because you might value one person, like Reed Hastings is founder of Netflix. So should he be valued more than Peter Hessler, who's written some great books and writes for the New Yorker, et cetera? I see, Michael, you put your hand up.
Well, I was just going to agree with Kathy totally. I mean, after the Peace Corps, I felt like a citizen of the world as opposed to a citizen of America. And I had a completely different point of view because we tend to think of the way we live as the way, most of the world lives, and it's exactly the opposite. We are the minority in the way we live. The world, most of the world lives in, the conditions that we served in. And I was in Panama as late as 2010, and I did have electricity and water, but there were many people serving there at the time, and they're still serving in those areas today where they don't have electricity and water. So, a lot of the world lives that way. When I was serving, the internet, the iPhone came out at the beginning of my service. And so that the internet was just beginning. We didn't have an internet connection where we served until the very end of my service. And when we think about how much we rely on the internet in the United States, and we just assume that everybody has this available to them, well, most people don't. And it's just a point of view that you don't realize when you're living in the United States, unless you really focus on it, that we are the exception, and not in the way people talk about American exceptionalism, but in the fact that we are living in, a completely different world than most people live in. But I wanted to go back to the point that Charlie mentioned, where somebody had a sticker on the bumper saying, "Thank you for your service." There was a point in the movie where somebody mentioned that Peace Corps could be an alternative to military service. And I don't know if that has ever been pursued, because I really think the Peace Corps is one of the reasons Americans don't know about it is because it's not really given the esteem that military service these days is given. But if Peace Corps were an alternative form of service, and there was a service requirement for all citizens, I think Peace Corps would be elevated in its importance generally. Has that idea gone anywhere?
I know there are a lot of efforts around. There's a Service Year Alliance. There, out of the Aspen Institute, there's a push towards national service, kind of trying to shift the culture so that we see national service as a natural thing that everybody does, kind of like the British gap year of traveling around the world. I know in Germany, when I was living there in the 80s, everybody was at the time was still a little more misogynistic, but it was males had to either join the military for a year, or they had the option to choose a year of civil service, and that could be working as an EMT, and that could be all kinds of different things. That could be in development. So I know that there is work being done here in the United States to get more of a service mindset going, to shift the cultures so that service becomes more integral to our culture. How far that goes is hard to say. I understand the Obama administration wasn't, like the Clinton administration was pushing hard for service. The Obama administration wasn't as much. There's great hope now for the Biden administration. Not sure whether service will be one of their main themes or not.
I know from history, Vietnam War, I found out that apparently the decision whether or not you could be deferred based upon your Peace Corps experience was a function of the local recruiting board locally. Because I know for some places you could get a deferment as long as you're a Peace Corps volunteer, and then you might be eligible. And then there's a guy here from Boulder who passed away a couple of years ago. He was in service, and he got his draft notice from his board, because apparently the Boulder board, no, that wasn't a reason why you could get a deferment. He got pulled and basically went to Vietnam pretty well much from his Peace Corps service.
Yeah. I heard that too. It was everything across the board, from being pulled directly out of service to getting a pass because you were in the Peace Corps, and a lot of people kind of aged out of the draft while being Peace Corps volunteers, to people getting their draft notices as in once you finish Peace Corps, you're in line next, and so on.
One of the things that I was aware of very directly in the manual, the Peace Corps manual at the time I went in '67, they said very clearly, Peace Corps service does not exempt you. It does not exempt males. They were the only ones in the draft, and there was the draft. And one of the volunteers in the same program I was, we were in a guidance program that the ministry had requested, Ministry of Education requested, and he was pulled home. So yes, every point you've made is right, but it was not considered automatic. And in the '67, that would have been a critical point.
And that came from the beginning, from the founding of the agency. There was already, I mean, Nixon right away called them draft dodgers, right? It was right away set up as a way that Peace Corps had to defend itself from the beginning and say, no, this is not a way to avoid the draft. And so it was very much put on the defensive early on with its service.
Suzanne, did you have anything else?
I actually have maybe a comment on veterans, because I happen to be a 2-corps person. I served the Marine Corps before I went into Peace Corps.
Mm-hmm.
And then I happened to be in the first, one of the first groups in Tanganyika 1. And I just made a quick count of the number of us that were veterans. And out of 35 people, 5 of us were veterans.
Wow.
So it really didn't count as a way of avoiding a draft.
Yeah.
I think Edwin was going to say something too.
I just thought one of the major differences in the Peace Corps from a lot of other aid organizations is language training. That makes all the difference in terms of relationships with locals and so forth. You're not sitting in your room drinking beer. You're out there getting invited to weddings and funerals, unfortunately, some cases, and so on. Living with families, so forth. But language is a critical thing to it, but also just the light to have 3 whole months of a language to start you out.
I agree. I think it's one of the strongest programs that the Peace Corps has. And, you know, when we were producing the documentary, it was very important to me that we would hear as many languages as possible. And so I was tickled when Jason Carter was willing to give us that South African saying about humanity, Ubuntu, and to be able to have not just the host country nationals speak in their language, but then also to be able to show off volunteers who were speaking in languages that weren't as familiar to Americans was important.
And I bet a lot of us can also still use it a little bit.
You know, here in Denver, my mother, who passed away a few years ago, but she passed away from Alzheimer's, and she was in an assisted living facility. And when I would visit her, it turned out that there were several people, service providers there working who were from Mali. And I made the mistake to admit that I knew some Bambara, and I greeted them in Bambara. And then, of course, I went, Ini Che, and they went, ha! I was like, oh God, Ini Che was about as far as I could go. But they were just so tickled that I knew some words in their language. And then they coached me every time I came, and they were very sweet. It felt like being back in Mali because they were like, Ini Che, Alana. So yeah, even here, and you know, I think of the Ethiopian community we have here in Colorado. We have one of the largest Ethiopian communities outside of Ethiopia, and they make up what makes Colorado's culture. And so while right now in Ethiopia the country is tearing apart over the Tigray province issues, that same thing is being reflected here. So I was talking to Return Peace Corps volunteer Janet Lee, who used to work at Regis and who travels back to Ethiopia regularly and works there, and she says, we're seeing those same problems. So I was asking her, so who do you talk to about what's going on? And she says, you know, depending on who you talk to, you will get these different sides of the story. And so in many ways, as Return Peace Corps volunteers, that work doesn't end, that story doesn't end, because we have the diaspora that we can still connect to.
Speaking of language, Nancy and I were talking about this the other day, that now a lot of people have in their signature line their pronouns and how they relate to all that. And we said that the thing about the language in Vanuatu that we learned, Bislama, actually the pronouns were gender neutral. So hem, H-E-M, meant she, he, or it. It's like, maybe we need to take that lesson from there and apply here in the United States, add a new word or two, you know, that are general neutral words, because they already exist, they're out there.
It's brilliant.
I noticed, to change the subject, that the Peace Corps volunteers that were evacuated, I was serving in Panama, they were evacuated to Panama from other countries in Central and South America, where the Peace Corps left the country for revolutionary reasons or whatever. They were never successful when they were evacuated to another country. And I was wondering if there's any work done on looking at the success of evacuated Peace Corps workers, because if so, this entire 100% evacuation idea sounds like it's bound to fail. I was just wondering, because the experience from my experience with the evacuees was that it never worked out.
It's a fascinating subject, and in my mind, I would love to see the endowed chair at a university that is a Peace Corps historian or scholar, and to see more studies on the Peace Corps. You can go to, I think it's JSTOR or wherever that firewall is for academic papers, and you can pull up the list of dissertations and theses that have been written about the Peace Corps. And there are some subject matters that are treated, but it's not this one centralized place where you can get that information. But evacuation is an incredibly important topic to study. And, I agree with you, the time is passing quickly that no volunteers are in the field. And these people that have been evacuated have to move on with their lives. They have to find jobs, they have to find work. And the further you go down that path, the more integrated you are, the harder it is to disconnect again and go back into the Peace Corps. So, and I'm saying the Peace Corps. I know a lot of people are saying Peace Corps, but Harris Wofford, one of the founders of the Peace Corps, corrected me. He said, no, it's the Peace Corps, because we wanted to have the same authority as the Marine Corps. So I'm trying to make an emphasis on the Peace Corps.
Same authority, but but not the same respect.
Probably depends upon who you're talking to. I kind of like that in a way. It's like the Marines are, they never talk about, I'm like an ex-Marine. I am, it's just part of their culture and who they view themselves. And I think Peace Corps volunteers, it's the same way. It's like you're never an ex. If Steve Werner was on this conversation, he would tell you about a conversation he had with Sergeant Shriver specifically about that. You're never an ex, you're never an alum. You are a returned Peace Corps volunteer and your service goes on. Do we have any other comments, questions? We've kind of loosened it up here because it's a small enough group. If you've got something and you'd like to share at this point, and if not, we'll wrap it up shortly and let everyone get on with their days.
I'm curious if there's anybody else there.
Oh, you muted yourself again.
Discontinued, excuse me.
We only heard half of your question.
Dad, we heard, I'm curious if.
I was curious as to how many people here were from a country that no longer had a program.
Beyond the evacuations, but the programs have been discontinued altogether.
Yep.
Randy served in Cote d'Ivoire. He's raising his hand for that. My father, if nobody clued in, Ed Smith is my father, served in Iran. Alana with Mali. And I think that one of the things that with the towering task, like I had forgotten that Peace Corps had been in Thailand, and then I know volunteers that served more recently. And so even reflecting on where Peace Corps has gone, left, and then maybe has come back sometimes is also really interesting.
India used to be a huge program.
The largest program. It had over 1,000 people, and they had 3 different country directors for the just 3 different regions.
I'm wondering if Peace Corps ever went back into Sierra Leone after the war.
I believe so.
Yeah.
Just pull up the spreadsheet.
Where's Isabel when you need her?
Yes, I'm pulling up Isabella's spreadsheet as I'm working here.
So for the current period of time where we've evacuated everybody, are we keeping the local staffs in those countries, or are we going to have to rebuild all those staffs again?
Right now, the staffs are on the ground there. So the country directors are still there. They kept the host country national staffs and continued paying them. So they didn't want to close any of the posts. So they've continued operating, probably also partially with the fear. I'm sure Jody's concern was that, Peace Corps had a bit of a bullseye on its back. The administration had on their list a list of government agencies to eliminate. Peace Corps was on that list, rumor has it. So evacuating all volunteers was a big risk to take because it would be much easier to eliminate an agency that didn't have anybody on the ground. So I think the compromise then was to keep the posts open, keep the staff there, and keep the American staff as well as the host country national staff working.
Do we have any other comments? If not, I think maybe it's time to thank Alana for her time today and appreciate all of your comments. So yes.
Let me take a quick minute and just talk about distribution before we adjourn. So we had to reinvent distribution. We're doing virtual screenings. That means they can happen anywhere, everywhere. So Peace Corps, we're connected, 1 degree of separation. Anybody who knows high school teachers, we're really middle school is where we can start, middle school, high school, colleges, community colleges, universities, grad programs, libraries, museums, conferences, planes, trains, and automobiles. There is no restriction of where we can show this film. And we would love to have all of you help with ideas, with connections. If you know the dean of some school or a librarian at some library or so, get the word out there that the film exists. And you can come to our website, peacecorpsdocumentary.com, or connect through RPCV Colorado. with any of the thoughts you have of where the film could be shown, where it should be shown, where we can reach people. Also funding, if you happen to know the founder of some company that is looking to raise their brand visibility. You know, we're working with PBS to get the film there. The film will have underwriter credits at the beginning and at the end of the show. So if there's a company that, you know, aligns philosophically with Peace Corps ideals, then, you know, like whether it's a coffee company that focuses on fair trade or social justice companies or so, if you know somebody, get those connections our way so we can make sure that we keep reaching the American public.
Thanks,
and let me
Alana.
just look up Sierra Leone really quickly so that I can answer the question about Sierra Leone.
While you're doing that, Alana, do you know Alan Mondale?
Yes, he did a documentary. He did Waging Peace, correct?
That's right. So I was going to make the connection for you. He's a friend of mine if you wanted me to connect you, but if you know him already, that's fine.
I have actually emailed with him. So thank you very much. So just quick answer to Sierra Leone. They went in 62 and then out in 94, and then they re-entered in 2010 and have been there. And I think it closed with the evacuation.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Sure, sure. But yeah, no, I liked Waging Peace. That was a nice documentary.
So I want to, again, thank you, Alana. I want to thank Suzanne, who's past president. She's still on the board advocacy chair. Matt O'Malley, who has been doing our hosting. He's been handling the hosting today. And also another board member who's on the call is my wife, Nancy Cole, who is the secretary of RPCV of Colorado. And with that, I would suggest to all of you, if you want to save the chat, down in the bottom of the chat, there's 3 little dots there, and then you can save the chat so you can have it there yourself. Matt, I will ask you to stop the record.